5. Does competition build character? Psychological considerations. A competitive culture endures by tearing people down. Jules Henry, Culture Against Man. Let us pretend for a moment that the popular mythology about competitions being necessary for excellence is true, which is to say that all of the evidence reviewed in Chapter 3 does not exist. Does this clinch the case for the desirability of competition? Not at all. The effect of competition on productivity tells us nothing about its effect on the competitors themselves. When we shift our attention from performance to people, we find more than enough reason to oppose competition. The question of psychological impact, while generally ignored by empirical studies, is a matter that touches us far more deeply than productivity. Even people who have never questioned the shibboleths about the usefulness of competition will confess that the ways it affects them and the people around them can be profoundly disquieting. Given a real choice, most of us will try to avoid unusually competitive organizations or activities. More significantly, we will steer clear of unusually competitive people. When we say that someone is one of the most competitive people around, we generally are not recommending that person as a friend. Such people, in fact, find themselves mistrusted if not simply avoided by others. When we become aware of our own competitiveness, we often become uncomfortable, a fact that is all the more remarkable in light of the professional rewards for acting this way. All told, the alleged benefits of competition do not keep most of us from reflecting on how the rat race of American life takes its psychological toll. This chapter will explore that toll carefully. It will argue that the closer we look, the more damaging we find competition to be. Its effects are sometimes insidious, sometimes practically invisible, but almost always unhealthy. Before considering the consequences of competition, however, it might be wise to look into its causes. The two questions, as we shall see, are more closely related than they might seem. Why we compete. The reasons for trying to be successful at the price of other people's failure are numerous and multilayered. Sociologists and anthropologists explain this, as they do most things, in terms of cultural norms. These norms congeal into structural competition, and can become so entrenched that non-competitive alternatives virtually disappear from the workplace, the schoolroom, and the playing field. This structural competition also shapes our attitudes and beliefs, thus encouraging intentional competition. Behavioral psychologists, meanwhile, are less concerned with norms than with the specific ways we are trained to be competitive. We are directly rewarded for displaying such behavior, and we also watch others being rewarded for it. As we saw in Chapter 2, the combination makes for an effective learning program. In simple language, we act competitively because we are taught to do so, because everyone around us does so, because it never occurs to us not to do so, and because success in our culture seems to demand that we do so. It does not deny the usefulness of these explanations to supplement them with the perspective of depth psychology, which is concerned with the unconscious roots of our behavior. Psychoanalysts have contributed incalculably to the way we think about ourselves, but one of their central contributions, whose relevance to competition will shortly become clear, is the idea that we may unconsciously turn a wish or fear into its opposite. This can happen in several ways. Unacceptable feelings of hostility toward people we are expected to love, for example, may be transposed into exaggerated concern. A dangerous attraction may present itself as extreme aversion, as in the classic case of the latent homosexual who incessantly ridicules gays. Finally, powerful anxieties may be dealt with by exposing oneself continuously to that which is dreaded. Thus, the person who is deeply fearful of being alone may avoid other people and make a fetish of privacy in an unconscious attempt to overcome the fear. Only when we understand these reversals can we grasp one of the most fascinating legacies of depth psychology, the insight that two apparently opposite kinds of behavior can be traced to the same underlying dynamic. If we are faced with someone who makes a fetish of privacy, we may come to see this as a manifestation of separation anxiety. But if we come across someone who hangs on to other people, even refusing to let go of destructive relationships, we may decide that this, too, can be understood in terms of separation anxiety. Very different, indeed antithetical, personality patterns often converge once we peer beneath the surface. This phenomenon is nowhere clearer than in the case of self-esteem. Mr. A is usually seen as conceited. He talks constantly about his talents and accomplishments. Ms. B, on the other hand, is almost paralyzed by her enduring conviction that she will fail at anything she tries. Both individuals, as almost everyone in this post-Freudian age will suspect, may have low self-esteem. But now let us add Mr. C, most of whose waking hours are devoted to seducing women, and Ms. D, who acquires power over others by eliciting personal details about their lives while revealing nothing of herself. Then there is Mr. E, who schedules his day with inordinate precision and is upset by anything that does not go according to plan. Ms. F, by contrast, is always late for appointments, extremely forgetful, and unable to direct her own life. More than any other single formulation, lack of self-esteem can profitably be used to make sense of all these individuals. In fact, we could continue through the alphabet with other personality capsules without exhausting its explanatory utility. As a concept, self-esteem is extremely useful for those trying to understand why people act as they do. As a reality, the importance of high self-esteem simply cannot be overstated. It might be thought of as the sine qua non of the healthy personality. It suggests a respect for and faith in ourselves that is not easily shaken, an abiding and deep-seated acceptance of our own worth. Ideally, self-esteem is not only high but unconditional. It does not depend on approval from others, and it does not crumble even when we do things that we later regret. It is a core, a foundation upon which a life is constructed. The absence of self-esteem, conversely, is at the root of a wide range of psychological disorders. Karen Homey, a theorist to whose work we will return, described all neurosis in terms of the absence of basic confidence in oneself. Another neo-Freudian, Harry Stack Sullivan, wrote that customarily low self-esteem makes it difficult indeed to maintain good feeling toward another person. In his major work, the humanistic psychologist Abraham Maslow similarly observed that satisfaction of the self-esteem need leads to feelings of self-confidence, worth, strength, capability, and adequacy, of being useful and necessary. But thwarting these needs produces feelings of inferiority, that in turn give rise to either basic discouragement or else compensatory or neurotic trends. Indeed, as one social psychologist recently concluded, few psychologists would disagree that positive self-esteem is essential to emotional well-being, or that negative self-esteem is integral to our understanding of many kinds of problems, from depression to narcissism, from severe character disorders to alienating patterns of dealing with other people. While we must always be on guard against reducing the complexity of human beings to a tidy theoretical framework, there is very little about our personalities that does not flow from how we feel about ourselves. I have argued that our behaviors sometimes turn our true motivations inside out, and I have emphasized the crucial role of self-esteem in the personality. When we put them together, these two ideas allow us to understand competitiveness more fully. Specifically, I would offer the proposition that we compete to overcome fundamental doubts about our capabilities and, finally, to compensate for low self-esteem. Let us consider the two components of this formulation in turn. First, competing at a given activity reflects insecurity with a particular facet of ourselves. We try to be the best lover, or have the most lovers, because we fear we are not really lovable. We want to have a more impressive job than others because we suspect our skills are actually deficient. Second, these specific capacities stand for a global sense of inadequacy, that is, low self-esteem. Lovableness or professional skills in these examples can be said to recapitulate the whole self. To say that we become invested in certain qualities is to say that they are placeholders for our very selves. Sometimes, though, there are no such placeholders, no mediating qualities or skills. Some competitive desires, to earn more money, for instance, or be judged more attractive, can be understood immediately in terms of low self-esteem. This is even more evident with people whose competitiveness is not restricted to a particular activity, those who turn almost every interaction into a contest. Here we see most sharply how the need to be best at anything at all, which is to say at everything, actually represents an attempt to stave off a persistent and pronounced sense that one is fundamentally no good. The important point, though, whether or not there is some mediating quality involved, is that competitiveness eventually comes down to self-esteem. Doing well, as we saw earlier, is different from doing better than others. This is nowhere clearer than in the case of their respective motivations. All of us enjoy the sense of accomplishment that comes from being particularly good at something. Sometimes it is convenient to assess that performance by comparing it to those of other people. But the individual who feels good about herself and is simply interested in doing well does not go out of her way to outperform others. She does not seek out relative judgments. She is content with a sense of personal satisfaction, sometimes buttressed, depending on the activity, by a consideration of absolute standards. She can check out the number of questions she answered correctly or see how long it took her to run the mile. The desire to be better than others feels quite different from this desire to do well. There is something inherently compensatory about it. One wants to outdo in order to make up for an impression, often dimly sensed, of personal inadequacy. Unlike the joy of flexing one's muscles or intelligence, which is sufficient unto itself, one wants to be stronger or smarter than others in order to convince oneself at some level that one is a good person. If competition has a voice, it is the defiant whine of the child. Anything you can do, I can do better. A competitive society is a chorus of such voices. And the energy of such a society, to switch metaphors, is provided by a combination of obsessional thinking, anxiety over personal inadequacy, and hostility requiring an outlet. According to Lawrence Frank, it is not quite accurate to talk about wanting to beat others, however, because one is responding to the push of self-doubt rather than the pull of accomplishment. Competition is more a need than a desire. Maslow has distinguished between B for being and D for deficit motivations with respect to love and cognition. Love, he said, is characterized by an almost aesthetic pleasure, an admiration for a specific person. D love is experienced as an urgent need, a drive whose object is generic. We can think of psychological growth as the process of moving from D to B. Only after our basic needs are met can we proceed to a higher level of loving and thinking and living. Notwithstanding the finery in which it comes dressed, competitiveness is in reality a deficit-motivated trait. Being good at an activity is something we choose to do. Outperforming others is experienced as something that we have to do. Our self-esteem is at stake. The obvious way to verify that competition is more a need than a desire is to see what happens when a competitive person is deprived of a chance to compete. Or, since the need to compete is really the need to win, we can watch what happens when such an individual loses. The result is more reminiscent of depriving a hungry person of supper than of removing a choice dish from the gourmet. One extraordinarily competitive businesswoman, who was transferred to a non-competitive work environment, described her situation to me recently as being like suffering a slow death. This sort of reaction suggests that one's very self is on the line. Lending further credence to this is the fact that the original urge to compete may be experienced as a fear of not competing. "Whenever I enter a competition," said one marathon runner, "I'm fearful and apprehensive to try it. It's hard to go to the line. But I'm fearful and apprehensive not to try it. To do something because the psychological consequences of not doing it are too painful is quite different from doing something because of the gratification it provides. When the opportunity to alleviate that pain is removed, we would expect a reaction of anxiety or panic or rage. Thus, the actual reactions of competitive people support the proposition that it is low self-esteem that motivates them. For many, competition feels like damage control. The point is not so much triumph as vindication, not so much winning as not losing. To lose is to have one's inadequacy exposed. It is dreadful confirmation of precisely what was feared in the first place. One struggles to win, to be better than everybody else, in a desperate, vain effort to convince oneself of one's value. But how can competition be deficit motivated if so many very competitive people are excellent at what they do? We sometimes need to be reminded that actual competence has little to do with self-esteem. No matter how many times they hear it, many talented or attractive people do not truly believe in their talent or attractiveness. Their quest to be noticed, rewarded, acknowledged is endless. It is like pouring liquid into a container with a hole in the bottom. This is because the source of the need lies not in the specific characteristic, but in the underlying matter of low self-esteem. Recognition for some particular ability doesn't address the matter of overall worth. There is nothing surprising, therefore, about the fact that even some very capable individuals need to prove how much better they are than others. If competitiveness is inherently compensatory, if it is an effort to prove oneself and stave off feelings of worthlessness, it follows that the healthier the individual, in the sense of having a more solid, unconditional sense of self-esteem, the less need there is to compete. The implication, we might say, is that the real alternative to being number one is not being number two but being psychologically free enough to dispense with rankings altogether. Interestingly, 2 sports psychologists have found a number of excellent athletes with immense character strengths who don't make it in sports. They seem to be so well put together emotionally that there is no neurotic tie to sport. Since recreation almost always involves competition in our culture, those who are healthy enough not to need to compete may simply end up turning down these activities. To all of this, one might object that deficient self-esteem does not in itself cause competition. This is quite true. Whereas many psychoanalysts, including Freud himself, tend to inspect the individual in a vacuum, the neo-Freudians have emphasized that human development, intrapsychic conflicts, and everything else take place in a particular environment. In order to do their job adequately, psychologists must be students not only of the individual or the family but of the culture as a whole. Thus we return to the sociological emphasis on norms and structures with which this section began. Each culture provides its own mechanisms for dealing with self-doubt. In our culture, which is wedded to the assumption that life is a zero-sum game, one of the chief mechanisms is competition. It is America's compensatory mechanism of choice. Low self-esteem, then, is a necessary but not sufficient cause of competition. The ingredients include an aching need to prove oneself and the approved mechanism for doing so at other people's expense. When we have both, we have millions of people who try to feel better by making the next person feel worse. Many people insist that they compete because success in our culture demands that they do so. There is considerable truth to this, and on one level, competing can be viewed as a deliberate strategy. But on another level, striving to outdo others is also the result of psychological needs, and it is in this respect that competing can be said to be unconsciously determined. In fact, these 2 levels are themselves causally related. The social norms that induce us to compete can shape our psychological state, as I will try to show in the next section. Just as it is important not to wave away structural forces by pretending that the problem is unique to unhealthy individuals, so we must not completely reduce competition to these structural forces, ignoring its psychological basis. The average American does not talk in terms of structural forces or socio-historical determinants. She says she competes because she fears being left behind if she doesn't. But this account, while grounded in an accurate reading of our society, is not exhaustive. The urge to become a winner can, and should, also be traced to underlying feelings of worthlessness. I do not want to shy away from the incendiary implications of all of this. To suggest in effect that many of our heroes, entrepreneurs and athletes, movie stars and politicians, may be motivated by low self-esteem, to argue that our state religion is a sign of psychological ill health, this will not sit well with many people. Yet most of these same people will agree there is something amiss with the fellow who cannot walk into a room without wondering whether he is the strongest or wealthiest, or his date is the prettiest, or his name is the best known. How is it that so many people accept the latter but resist the former? The answer lies in the popular assumption that anything which is dangerous or unhealthy in excess is just fine in moderation. While we grow concerned, for example, about the person who can't function when a loved one leaves for even a short while, we find nothing wrong with wanting to spend some time with one's beloved. The problem is with the excess, and the extreme version of love, if it can still be called love, could be said to be qualitatively different from more moderate desire. But is competition like love? In a society where most of us are somewhat competitive, we like to reassure ourselves by assuming that it is. Actually, though moderate competitiveness and excessive competitiveness are only quantitatively, rather than qualitatively, different, their psychological causes are identical. A small handgun may be less noticeable or powerful than a bazooka, but the purpose of the two instruments is essentially the same. The hyper-competitive person may stand out in a crowd because of the urgency of his need to be the best, but the psychological forces at work are no different from those operating in people whose level of competitiveness is judged acceptable. He is just more extreme. Imagine a society in which interrupting other people was encouraged, just as competing against other people is encouraged in our own. Suppose further that some people interrupted so frequently, and so loudly that they never heard anyone but themselves. These people would likely be criticized and assumed to be neurotic for their need to interrupt in this fashion. Everyone else would be seen as engaging in healthy interruption. Leave aside the question of whether interrupting is an unwelcome behavior. We are not dealing here with consequences, but only with motivation. What should be clear is that the need to overpower others in conversation once in a while is different only in degree from the need to overpower others in conversation all the time. The psychological source of this behavior does not change with its intensity or frequency. And the same is true of competition. If we can use the word unhealthy to describe behavior that is deficit motivated or that arises from low self-esteem, then our startling conclusion must be that healthy competition is a contradiction in terms. It is not the excess that is problematic in the relentlessly competitive individual, it is the need to compete in itself. The relentless competitor is simply more noticeable, and he affords us the luxury of condemning him while sparing ourselves. In reality, he is but an exaggeration of ourselves. What we see in neuroses, said Horney, is only a magnified picture of what is often normal in a competitive culture. It is rather like the person who unthinkingly cheats on his tax returns but becomes outraged over instances of real theft. The big-time thief is really just the ordinary tax cheat writ large. The technique is different, as is the number of zeros, but the motivation is exactly the same. To be sure, we should not pass lightly over the fact that some people are more desperate than others in their need to win. This desperation can be measured in terms of the felt intensity of the drive, the number of arenas in which it is experienced, the amount of pain associated with losing, and so forth. The extremely competitive individual often will project his own view of the world onto the situations he confronts, approaching virtually any environment as if it were objectively set up as a contest. Life is a constant struggle to stay on top, to be number one. Everything is seen in zero-sum terms, so that someone else's good fortune will occasion his anger or self-pity, as if there were only so much happiness to go around. Even when he is not personally involved, his first inclination will be to construe any situation or encounter he hears about in competitive terms. He assumes others are as competitive as he, that rivalry is the way of the world, that his status is always on the line. Now, obviously, not every person with a streak of competitiveness about him is in such dire straits. It makes sense to speak of a continuum. The greater the desperation, the lower the self-esteem, the worse the problem. The point, then, is not that anyone who is at all competitive is in urgent need of psychological help, but rather that significant differences in degree do not always make a difference in kind. The need to be better than others has the same essential psychological origin, regardless of its severity. Finally, it should be noted that the need to win and the terror of losing are both exacerbated by the fact that most competitions are public events. It is not the simple fact of victory, the private knowledge of one's superiority, that is used to overcome doubts about oneself. It is the fact that this victory will be noticed. If competition's destination is reassurance about oneself, its vehicle is approval from others. Not just winning, but the acceptance that is supposedly attendant on winning. This is the appeal of competition. In sports, acceptance may mean the approval of the coach, as former pro football player Dave Megizi writes, although I played time and again with injuries, and told myself I was doing this because it was in the best tradition of the game, it was really to get approval from the coaches. We moved in an Oedipal lockstep. The more approval they gave me, the more fanatically I played. The Oedipal reference here signifies, of course, that the coach functions as a parent's surrogate. In her interviews with competitive swimmers, Jennifer Levin found that love, a family, the approval of a significant paternal figure, came up time and time again when women spoke of the early motivation to compete. The psychoanalytic equation runs something like this. Winning equals coach's approval equals parents' acceptance equals acceptance of self, self-esteem. Often approval is sought from spectators, too, and this is not only true of athletic contests. Other kinds of competition offer the same sort of reinforcement. There are the office mates who quickly learn of one's promotion, the dinner companions who listen to one's games of one-upmanship, the other students who see the honor roll posted on the wall. Furthermore, as Stuart Walker observes, competitors seek to be admired and accepted by those they compete against. The competitor returns to competition repeatedly and seeks to perform well, partly in order to please them. He knows that all the world loves a winner, and believes that his competitors will love him when he wins. Where there is no love, envy will do. Where approval is not forthcoming, it will simply be assumed. To be number one is, above all, to be noticed, whether by parent, coach, observer, or opponent. To be noticed is to be someone. To be a someone soothes a trembling self-esteem. Winning, losing, and self-esteem. A personality attribute could be considered healthy with regard to its effects even if it seemed unhealthy in light of its motivation. So we ask, is competitiveness a psychologically constructive force? Does the act of competing strengthen the shaky self-esteem that gave rise to it? Such an effect might take place for the simple reason that living up to the norms of one's culture is rewarding. When we do what is expected of us, we feel better about ourselves, and competitiveness is expected of us in this particular society. Where competition is not the norm, we would expect that this effect would not exist, and we would be right. But even in a very competitive society, the cultural norm effect is overshadowed by the dynamics of competition itself. These dynamics, unhappily, have just the opposite result, undermining rather than bolstering self-esteem. In her studies of children in the mid-1970s, educational psychologist Carol Ames decided to see how children act under competitive conditions. She found that competition can cause people to believe they are not the source of, or in control of, what happens to them. Besides its disturbing implications for self-esteem, this external locus also inhibits performance, according to Ames. People who do not see themselves as directing their own actions tend to be lower achievers. Yet another explanation for the data showing that competition does not lead to higher productivity. Other researchers have approached this question by looking for personality attributes that are correlated with competitiveness. This does not prove a causal relation, of course. The other characteristics may even be the reason for competitiveness rather than a result of it. The evidence, however, is highly suggestive. In 1981, 2 psychologists studied more than 800 high school students to see what other characteristics described those who were competitive. Students reporting positive attitudes toward competitive relationships with others, they discovered, are unique by virtue of their greater dependence on evaluation and performance-based assessments of personal worth. Far from having unconditional self-esteem, the way the competitive subjects viewed themselves depended inordinately on how well they did at certain tasks and on what others thought of them. The studies concerned with structural competition have typically used alternative arrangements, notably cooperation, as points of reference. The question then becomes, which is the better way to elicit the kinds of traits we think of as healthy, by having people compete or cooperate? In a competitive society like ours, it is common to assume that cooperation discourages a strong sense of self, that it has a whiff of dependence about it. In fact, just the opposite seems to be true. From a review of 17 separate studies, David and Roger Johnson concluded that cooperative learning situations, compared with competitive and individualistic situations, promote higher levels of self-esteem and healthier processes for deriving conclusions about one's self-worth. Cooperativeness, they have written elsewhere, is positively related to numerous indexes of psychological health such as emotional maturity, well-adjusted social relations, strong personal identity, and basic trust in and optimism about other people. And while competition promotes an external locus of control, cooperation promotes an internal locus of control. Those who work with, rather than against, others feel more in control of their own lives. Other researchers have found much the same thing. When Elliot Aronson tried out a model of cooperative learning in elementary schools, he found that participating students developed greater self-esteem than children in traditional classrooms. Another sociologist, Ruth Rubinstein, used a written measure of self-esteem with children between the ages of 10 and 14 who attended either a competitive or non-competitive summer camp. Self-esteem levels did not change significantly in the former camp, but they increased for both boys and girls in the latter. Morton Deutsch has found that self-esteem is more negative under the competitive as compared with the cooperative grading system. From his cross-cultural work with children, finally, Terry Orlick arrived at the conclusion that experiences in human cooperation are the most essential ingredient for the development of psychological health. Whereas cooperation apparently contributes to high self-esteem, competition often seems to have the opposite effect. Why should this be? The first part of the question is easier to answer. Cooperation, which involves sharing skills, is, as we have already seen, a more productive arrangement. The greater success it yields helps each participant feel better about himself. Second, cooperation promotes greater interpersonal attraction, as we will see in the next chapter. People feel valuable and valued when their success is positively related to that of others, rather than negatively related, as in competition. That cooperation is healthy, then, should not be surprising. By the same token, competition's effect on performance and interpersonal regard may tell us something about its unhappy psychological consequences. But we can go further than this. There are several very good reasons why trying to outperform other people fails to allay the very self-doubt that gave rise to this behavior. The simplest explanation is that most competitors lose most of the time. By definition, not everyone can win, and in practice, few do. In a one-on-one contest, the odds are 50-50. More commonly, competition is structured to produce a single champion and many more losers. If we feel impelled to prove ourselves by triumphing over others, we will feel humiliated when they triumph over us. To lose, particularly in a public event, can be psychologically detrimental even for the healthiest among us. At best, some exceptional individuals might emerge without damage to their self-esteem, but it is difficult to see how losing can enhance it. No one in a culture as competitive as ours is unfamiliar with the experience of being flooded with shame and self-doubt upon losing some sort of contest. And when we add the phenomenon of anticipating loss to the occasions of actually losing, it becomes clear that the potential for humiliation, for being exposed as inadequate, is present in every competitive encounter. The more importance that is placed on winning, in the society, in the particular situation, or by the individual, the more destructive losing will be. The greater the investment. As Stuart Walker put it, the greater will be the grief when we fail. When emphasis is placed not upon what is accomplished but upon what is publicly recognized, not upon the demonstration of competence but upon winning, then the competitor eventually comes to believe that he is defective and deserves to fail. Walker is describing the process of internalizing failure, of coming to equate losing with being a loser. It is a gradual process, but it is taking place at any given instant in our playing fields and classrooms, our offices, and even our homes. As we might expect, this terrible process takes place more rapidly and decisively with those whose self-esteem is precarious to begin with. Self-doubt will predispose such people to expect failure, to be crushed by it when it comes, and even, as we will see later, to help bring it about. But competition does not kick only those who are already down. Ames found that even high self-concept children tended to be more self-critical following failure in competitive than non-competitive encounters. For these high self-concept children, losing meant not only becoming very critical of themselves but also coming away with inflated perceptions of the other's ability and deservingness. Over time, Ames speculates, this could begin to undermine their own positive self-appraisal and contribute to a learned helplessness belief. Further, the differences in other perceptions may have negative implications for future social encounters. Frank Ryan, a sports psychologist, argues that the adverse effects of losing are particularly severe among those who are better competitors. Thus, following a failure in competition, the poor competitor is usually relaxed, in good spirits, and even talkative. In contrast, the good competitor who has had a bad day is difficult to live with. He becomes temporarily a bitter, morose, and sometimes unpleasant person. Ryan, who is not a critic of competition, is concerned here only with what he takes to be temporary consequences. Bitterness and unpleasantness, he says, are indicators of a successful competitor, which is what we are strongly encouraged to become. Not low self-esteem but a winning record is what brings about these effects, he is contending. The larger point is that anyone, regardless of self-esteem, can be shaken by loss. And apart from the actual number of times someone loses, losing is always possible and often anticipated. It is an inherent part of competition, and thus there is reason to think that competition is always psychologically damaging to some degree. But even this does not tell the whole story. Psychological health implies unconditionality, the conviction that one is a good person regardless of what happens. In competition, by contrast, one's self-esteem depends on the uncertain outcome of a contest, and this means that self-esteem is conditional. At best, one feels reassured and confirmed only sometimes. Since the idea is for self-esteem to exist without any strings attached, sometimes defeats the whole purpose. Despite this conditionality, though, doesn't winning contribute to the high self-regard that is the undergirding of mental health? Can it offset the ill effects of losing for the victor? Victory, after all, is the goal, both the structural objective of the competitive encounter and the psychological rationale for participating. And winning is a tonic. No one who has been awarded a prestigious prize or clinched a title or defeated a long-standing rival can deny the thrill of triumph. Despite this excitement, however, winning fails to satisfy us in any significant way and thus cannot begin to compensate for the pain of losing. This is true, first, for structural reasons. Winning offers no genuine comfort because there is no competitive activity for which victory is permanent. Whether we are talking about chairman of the board, Super Bowl champions, or the perversely prized status of most heavily armed nation, to become number one is immediately to become the target for one's rivals. King of the Mountain is more than a child's game, it is the prototype for all competition. Subjectively, the status of being envied and targeted by others may be superficially gratifying, but it is also deeply unsettling. Objectively, the reality is that it is only a matter of time until one becomes a loser again. Even after winning the Super Bowl, writes George Leonard, Dallas Cowboys coach Tom Landry still wore his mask of fear. The problem is this, he continues, even after you've just won the Super Bowl, especially after you've just won the Super Bowl, there's always next year. If winning isn't everything, it's the only thing, then the only thing is nothing, emptiness, the nightmare of life without ultimate meaning. In some arenas, the problem isn't just having to win again next year but having to compete in a new population. The high school valedictorian finds her status counts for very little upon entering college. The contest, with the pressure, begins all over again. The writer competes against other writers for the opportunity to be published. Then he must compete within his publishing house for attention and money so that his book will be adequately publicized and distributed. Then he struggles for attention and sales, reviews and prizes. No sooner does the performing artist beat out others in an audition than she must begin the process again, perhaps at a higher level of prestige. Even a competition enthusiast like Harvey Rubin is forced to concede that Many strong competitors, upon reaching the summit of their aspirations, see their goals receding constantly the higher they climb on the social or economic scale. The discovery, ultimately, that making it is often a hollow gain is one of the most traumatic events that the successful competitor can experience. The problem runs far deeper than these structural limitations, however. Apart from the objective absence of finality to competitive success, there is the psychological gulf between euphoria and fortification of self-esteem. One can get a powerful high from any number of substances and feel temporarily good about oneself and the world, but it would be difficult to argue that a snort of cocaine or a shot of whiskey can improve one's psychological health in any meaningful way. Winning similarly feels good but fails to address the underlying dynamics that gave rise to competitiveness in the first place. First, the focus in competition is on proving one's superiority to other people, and this, as we have seen, is not at all the same thing as establishing one's competence. In terms of both motivation and the skills involved, winning and succeeding are two different things. To beat any number of others is not a satisfying indicator of actual skill or accomplishment. Second, and more important, even if one could demonstrate competence at a specific skill just by winning, this very specificity is limiting. One may be able to make oneself wealthier or more attractive than the next person, but no such particular quality gets to the heart of the matter. We want to be assured that we are fundamentally good, but goodness is difficult to pin down. The more desperate we are to believe in it, the more it seems to elude us. Thus we resort to reifying this goodness, externalizing it, literalizing it, trying to capture it in a specific quality. But being number one with respect to this quality can never satisfy the deeper, more global need for which it stands. The proof for this argument lies in the ephemerality of victory's thrill. We may be giddy with delight for a time, but we soon come back to earth. In fact, those who compete on a regular basis report that both the intensity of the pleasure and its duration decline sharply over time, precisely as one develops a tolerance to a drug. After winning 7 gold medals at the 1972 Olympics, Mark Spitz reported, "I became sick of myself. I never knew how far down someone could drop, especially after being up so high." Even without such a pronounced mood shift, any competitor knows that the effects of winning are not lasting, and this alone tells us of its irrelevance to psychological health. Self-esteem is not a passing thrill. But if we are not really reassured or satisfied even when we win, what do we do when the pleasure fades? We compete again. This answer is immediately obvious to us based on our experience, but quite puzzling when we pause to consider the situation rationally. Instead of turning to other, more promising, means for meeting our needs, we return to the very approach that has failed us. Although boat racer Stuart Walker is, like Rubin, an enthusiast of competition, he accurately identifies this cycle. Winning doesn't satisfy us. We need to do it again and again. The taste of success seems merely to whet the appetite for more. When we lose, the compulsion to seek future success is overpowering. The need to get out on the course the following weekend is irresistible. We cannot quit when we are ahead, after we've won, and we certainly cannot quit when we're behind, after we've lost. We are addicted. The act of returning again and again to a strategy that fails does indeed suggest that something very like an addiction is at work here. One thinks of the compulsive gambler. He loses money and is driven to make it back in the next hand, or race or game. He wins money and, unsatisfied, tries to win still more. Instead of contributing to our self-esteem, then, beating other people contributes only to the need to continue trying to beat other people. The consequence of competition and the cause of competition are reciprocally related, just as the consequence and cause of drinking salt water. When we talk about competition, we are talking about a vicious circle. The more we compete, the more we need to compete. Feelings of competition cover the deeper feelings of insecurity. The competitive feelings then produce a new set of feelings of failure, lack of confidence, and inadequacy, which, in turn, begets further competitiveness. This cannot be conveniently dismissed as the profile of a neurotic individual. As we shall see shortly, it is a description of how competition itself works. The strength of this cycle is not uniform for all people, however. We would expect that the intensity of the effective competition would reflect the intensity of the original need to compete. This means that those whose self-esteem is lowest, whose psychological need is greatest, are those who will be most viciously hooked on competition. The effect is most powerful where the need is most pronounced. The other variable that affects the strength of the cycle is the importance placed on winning in the specific situation, and, in the long run, by the entire society. The more we reward being number one, the more we contribute to an addiction to competition. This is an addiction that takes hold despite competition's failure to contribute to our self-esteem, or rather, precisely because of this failure. And since, as we have seen, both winning and losing have undesirable effects, it seems clear that the problem lies with competition itself. Denying the damage. At the end of the Monty Python movie The Life of Brian, scores of people who have been nailed to crosses begin bobbing their heads and singing a cheerful ditty called "Always Look on the Bright Side of Life." This irreverent sequence neatly satirizes a relentless, Candide-style optimism which should be quite familiar to us. One need not look very hard to find examples, often ludicrous, sometimes touching, of people trying to convince themselves that their suffering has a hidden purpose, that there is some underlying advantage to any terrible event that befalls them, that there may be no reason for pain, no ultimate purpose to human life, no redeeming justification for loss. These recognitions can be too much to bear. And while less dramatic, self-defeating personality attributes and unpleasant situations can evoke the same frantic process of justification. Thus Karen Homey points out that people who are morbidly dependent and self-effacing may believe these characteristics mean they are loving and humble. Those who are detached and alienated from others may congratulate themselves on their freedom. We see the same thing in the case of people who are competitive, or whose lives are immersed in a competitive environment. Competing drags us down, devastates us psychologically, poisons our relationships, interferes with our performance. But acknowledging these things would be painful and might force us to make radical changes in our lives, so instead we create and accept rationalizations for competition. It's part of human nature. It's more productive. It builds character. The last of these beliefs is the most remarkable. Empirical claims about inevitability or performance are relatively distant from ourselves, and an argument about them can be carried on in a wholly intellectual fashion. But the contention that competition is psychologically beneficial contradicts the intuitive knowledge that I believe most of us possess. Despite direct awareness of what competition does to people, to say nothing of the kind of analysis offered here, some individuals persist in claiming that its effects are constructive. This is a powerful example of how it is possible to adjust our beliefs so as to escape the threatening realization that we have been subjecting ourselves to something terrible, that we have internalized a corrosive personality attribute. Also, this may be why the traditional assumption that competitive sport builds character is still with us today in spite of overwhelming contrary evidence. Apart from the absence of data to support it, the adage itself is exceedingly slippery. One sports sociologist reports that of all the writers he has encountered who repeat this assertion, not a single one actually defined the word character, let alone provided evidence for the claim. Character was typically assumed to be understood as desirable and wholesome, or it was defined implicitly by association with such adjectives as clean-cut, red-blooded, upstanding, desirable, and so forth. For Douglas MacArthur, competition is a vital character builder, in the sense that it makes sons into men. This definition, besides being irrelevant to half the human race, tells us nothing about which features of being a man are considered desirable. In what may be the only explicit research of this claim, Ogilvy and Tutko could find no empirical support for the tradition that sport builds character. Indeed, there is evidence that athletic competition limits growth in some areas. Among the problematic results they discovered were depression, extreme stress, and relatively shallow relationships. Ogilvy and Tutko also found, as mentioned before, that many players, with immense character strengths, avoid competitive sports. Finally, they discovered that those who do participate are not improved by competition. Whatever strengths they have were theirs to begin with. Presumably related to the idea of character are such notions as self-confidence and well-being, as well as self-esteem. Popular magazines often contain articles asserting that competition promotes these things, and such unsubstantiated claims find a ready audience. Other proponents of competition take the more moderate view that while competition may well damage self-esteem, it does not always have this effect. Richard W. Egerman, a philosopher, offers 3 such arguments, which will be considered in turn. First, he proposes that competition may be harmful only to children, who may be peculiarly liable to dangers of comparisons of relative worth in a way that adults are not. It is true that much of the research on competition's psychological and performance-related effects has been conducted with children. However, this probably reflects the accessibility of children as research subjects and the special interest in children on the part of the investigators rather than an assumption that adults do not experience the same effects. Certainly, most theoretical studies of competition, including this one, are also concerned with its consequences for adults. Children may well be peculiarly liable to its dangers, as Egerman suggests, because of their greater malleability. Indeed, a recent panel of sports medicine experts urged that children under the age of 8 or 10 should not participate in organized, competitive sports because they could impede children's psychological, sociological, and motor skill development. But this does not argue against the unfortunate consequences of competition at any age. The dynamics of self-esteem that make competition detrimental in our youth are not features that we outgrow. And research on the benefits of cooperation is just as strong for adults as it is for students. Second, Egerman contends that competition is damaging only for the insecure or neurotic competitor. The problem, in other words, rests with the individual and not with competition itself. This is the same assumption we encountered in the last chapter with critics who suggest that we can leave competitive games in place so long as players care less about who wins them. It is also similar to an assumption we will consider later, namely, that cheating and violence are aberrant behavior for which the wrongdoer alone, and not competition, per se, should be blamed. Now, clearly, structural competition will not elicit the same degree of intentional competition, and its attendant features, from everyone. But as should also be clear by now, even solid self-esteem does not confer talismanic protection from the effects of losing. Likewise, the vicious circle engendered by the hollowness of winning is not an event to which only neurotics are admitted, although the speed at which the circle turns may be a function of psychological health. The hypothesis that the problem lies with some competitors and not with competition itself becomes increasingly less plausible each time we see the same essential pattern repeated with different people and in diverse arenas. It is like the psychoanalyst who one day realizes that the similarity of his patient's problems, e.g., dependency and self-punishment rituals in women, points to something beyond these individuals, to values woven into the institutional fabric of our society. In this case, we must recognize that the problem rests squarely with the structure of mutually exclusive goal attainment. We need not know anything about the individuals involved to see the destructive potential of a system that says only one of them can be successful. As Morris Rosenberg put it in his book Society and the Adolescent Self-Image, whenever a value is set forth which can only be attained by a few, the conditions are ripe for widespread feelings of personal inadequacy. Egerman's last argument is that losing doesn't have to be experienced as failure. This is true, first, he says, because only when one could reasonably have expected to win does losing mean failing. He offers the case of someone who runs a major marathon faster than he has ever done before but is nevertheless beaten by a well-known athlete. Surely such a loss will not be construed as failure. This qualification is quite sound, and it has the unintended effect of proving that success and winning are two very different things, see Chapter 3. It is true that there are some contests in which people take part without hope of winning. Losing is less likely to represent a crushing blow in cases of low intentional competition, that is, where one is not concerned about being number one. But the relevant question is what proportion of competitive encounters this describes. Most of us enter, or are involved, willy-nilly, in contests where winning is entertained as a distinct possibility, distinct enough so that losing hurts. Egerman goes on to assert that most competitors usually do entertain fairly realistic impressions of what they are capable, and thus are cushioned from the pain of loss. In the absence of hard data, this is a very dubious judgment indeed. But more important, it ignores the structural component of competition, the simple fact that losing means failure in a competitive context. It also ignores the fierce pressure to win and the stigma of losing that attend most contests. Only in extraordinary situations, such as a major marathon, for example, can one opt out of this context and assign another meaning to loss. Consider a team of children that has just lost a game. Having been carefully instructed to be good sports, they chant, 2, 4, 6, 8, who do we appreciate? And then name the victorious team. But the chant is perfunctory and the kids are dispirited, resentful, sullen. As adults, we manage to camouflage our feelings more effectively when we congratulate the winner. But this is largely a matter of going through the motions of pretending that losing is not important. However generous our disposition or high our self-esteem, we can scarcely help but feel the brunt of a loss given the nature of competition itself and the powerful forces of a competitive society. Being a good loser is a matter of rearranging our face and affecting an attitude. In no way does this posture touch, or reflect, the actual ramifications of loss. It is at best an exercise in self-deception to insist to ourselves and our children that losing should not matter. It is obvious to a 6-year-old that it matters very much, because she has been told this repeatedly, and in various ways. One cartoon has a little league coach giving a pep talk to a small boy. "Okay, old buddy, get in there and play the game, win or lose. But remember, nice guys finish last, there's no such word as chicken, and every time you lose you die a little." An article in a magazine for young women contains the bold-face heading, "Don't worry about failure," even though readers have been instructed just 4 sentences earlier that the point of playing games is to learn that the object is to try to win. Stuart Walker reverses himself within a single sentence. Everyone makes mistakes, he who makes the fewest wins. These illustrations are unusually blatant, but the same sort of mixed messages are given and received constantly. For every proclamation along the lines of, "It's how you play the game that counts," or "Making the effort is the important thing," or "All these kids out here today are winners," there are several powerful reminders that no one has the right to celebrate except number 1. The simultaneous presence of these 2 levels of socialization throughout our culture has been observed for many years. While paying respectful homage to cooperative ideals, wrote May and Dub in the 1930s, we go right on with our competitive system. In the 1950s, John R. Seeley's classic study of suburban life turned up the same phenomenon. In order to succeed, he said, the child must compete, but he must not seem competitive. The school deals with the dilemma by overtly promoting cooperation, and by covertly tolerating competition. In the 1970s, yet another set of social scientists described our rather schizophrenic condition, whereby encouragement of cooperative behavior is confined to moralistic maxims, while schools and other institutions in our society focus on developing competitive behaviors. Apart from the harms of competition, one could argue that this double bind represents a disorienting, destructive pattern in itself. The point here, though, is simply this: to argue that competitors cope well with failure is usually to mistake appearance for reality. The appearance of someone untroubled by loss probably reflects the moralistic maxims he has been taught. The other, far more substantial message he has absorbed concerns how important winning really is, how much it really does matter. In his panegyric to sports, Michael Novak writes, "No use saying, 'It's only a game.' It doesn't feel like a game." The anguish and depression that seize one's psyche in defeat are far deeper than a mere comparative failure, deeper than recognition of the opponent's superiority. A game tests, somehow, one's entire life. It tests one's standing with fortune and the gods. Defeat is too like death. His florid language aside, Novak is simply describing the psychological destructiveness of losing, the threat to self-esteem. This is a threat that is only papered over with appearances of graceful defeat. It is a threat that is neither mitigated by the realistic perceptions of competitors nor magically outgrown when we reach adulthood. It is a threat intrinsic to the win-slash-lose model that is then exacerbated by a culture which brutally dismisses whatever is not number one. One final argument in behalf of competition needs to be examined. This is the position that while losing may indeed be construed as failure, this is not really a bad thing. On the contrary, some people tell us, failing keeps us from becoming too big for our britches, and prepares children for the hard knocks of life. This argument is rarely propounded by psychologists and other serious students of human behavior, but it is widely heard nonetheless, and so deserves a response. It is surely valuable to learn that one cannot always be successful. One runs into obstacles both internal, a creative block, for instance, and external, and it is appropriate to realize that this is a fact of life. Infantile omnipotence fantasies are best laid to rest. However, some people go much further than this and romanticize failure so as to make it seem more bearable. This tendency represents the same need to convince oneself of the usefulness of pain that was discussed at the beginning of this section. Once this motivation is set aside, it becomes clear that the value of failing is very limited indeed. Most frustrations are psychologically redundant and often positively harmful. The position that children, in particular, ought to compete in order to get used to losing is based on a largely discredited assumption of human development, namely, that depriving children is the best way to prepare them for the rude shocks of life. The hypothesis cannot be neatly confirmed or disconfirmed empirically, but its converse is actually far more plausible, not to mention more humane. It is unconditional acceptance in our early years that best allows us to deal with rejection. It is an initial sense of security that helps us to weather the problems we will later face. Again, it may be true that some limited acquaintance with failure is useful. But parents who systematically withhold approval or pleasures from their children or deny them the chance to experience success typically have unconscious reasons for doing so, such as shoring up their own doubtful self-esteem or trying to punish their parents for depriving them. These hidden agendas are then simply rationalized as being in the child's best interest. The idea that we are best prepared for unpleasant experiences by being exposed to unpleasant experiences at a tender age is about as sensible as the proposition that the best way to help someone survive exposure to carcinogenic substances is to expose him to as many carcinogens as possible in early life. Even if we grant a limited usefulness to the experience of failure, furthermore, it is important to emphasize that this experience need not involve losing in competition. One can fall short of one's own expectations and develop all the appropriate virtues of tenacity and discipline. Competitive loss is a particularly noxious kind of failure, one that contains messages of relative inferiority, and that typically exposes one to public judgment and shame. Let it be granted that men should face mortal risks when they are seasoned to it, and be schooled to self-reliance under stern adversity, writes John Harvey. It may still be found possible to secure these ends without making men, so much as now, the enemies of their neighbors. Competition. To say that failing has its value, then, is not at all to justify competition and anxiety. Its effect on self-esteem, as serious as it is, does not exhaust the psychological consequences of competition. This section will consider the matter of insecurity and anxiety. The following section will touch on still other effects. Many are closely related to self-esteem, but they merit individual attention nonetheless. A number of psychologists have proposed that optimal human functioning presupposes a sense of security about the world, a confidence that it is a safe place and one's needs will be met. One's trust in the world out there is closely related to one's trust in oneself. If I cannot depend on what is around me, I will lack the means to accept myself, and I may even come to blame myself for the world as I experience it. That the process of competing can threaten our sense of security will be obvious to anyone who has ever competed. One of the reasons competition interferes with productivity, as we saw in Chapter 3, is that it can be not only unpleasant but an occasion for severe anxiety. This effect has been noted in several research projects. One study found that pupils performing a motor steadiness task became more anxious when they had to compete. Another experiment, involving undergraduates, discovered that competitively structured discussion sections made students feel distinctly more tense and anxious than they did in the cooperative sessions. This anxiety went hand in hand with a greater incidence of self-oriented needs and a loss of self-assurance, underscoring again the link between security and self-esteem. Other investigators, meanwhile, have observed that athletics can be a continual source of anxiety, even for the most talented players. We can identify 3 reasons that competition leaves us insecure and anxious. The first and most obvious is apprehension about losing. Regardless of talent or psychological healthiness, the experience of having to prove oneself by outperforming someone else is invariably unsettling, to say the least. The constant possibility of being defeated simply is not conducive to feeling secure. When we do actually lose, this effect is compounded in subsequent competitive encounters. The process soon takes the form of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The fear of losing makes it more likely that this is just what will happen. Apart from its effect on performance, of course, anxiety is undesirable in its own right. It is one more unhappy legacy of the race to win. The second reason for our anxiety concerns feelings of apprehension about winning. Now this seems most paradoxical given that the whole point of competition is to win. But if we think about it, we realize that it is not uncommon for capable competitors to trip themselves up just as it seems they are about to triumph. Consider the case of athletes who choke in the final round, a phenomenon that only recently has become the subject of scholarly interest. The psychoanalytic tradition helps us to see that this pattern is neither random nor inexplicable. Rather, such people are recoiling from winning in a deliberate, if unconscious, way. Why should they do this? Orthodox psychoanalysts believe that the prototype of all competition is the Oedipal contest with the same-sex parent, the prize being the opposite-sex parent. The little boy, Freud tells us, is deeply conflicted about this contest, since he believes punishment, specifically castration, will result if he is successful. Winning mommy's love, then, later, the act of winning itself, is terribly threatening because of this anticipated consequence. Unconsciously, the presumed wrath of the father may turn victory into a prospect as dreadful as defeat. Like many others, I find this explanation both fanciful and reductive. As it happens, there are 2 other possibilities that also make use of unconscious processes, but do not require us to assume that an early childhood event neatly accounts for one's adult behavior. The first is simply that competitors may feel guilty for making other people lose and thus either punish themselves for doing so in the past or take steps to avoid doing so in the present. The second explanation is that competitors may fear that the people they beat will become hostile toward them. Karen Horney has written at length about this reason for fearing victory. In many neurotics, anxiety concerning the hostility of others is so enormous that they are afraid of success, even if they feel certain of attaining it, she says. While this can be conscious, the neurotic more often is aware not of his fear but of the resulting inhibitions. When such a person plays tennis, for example, he may feel when he is close to victory that something holds him back and makes it impossible for him to win. What holds him back is the fear that the person he beats will resent him for this and dislike him. The relationship between the 2 people may suffer and the winner will feel cast off, disconnected, unwanted. Others may admire his victory, but the more substantial kind of approval that is closer to nurturance and love may be withdrawn, and it is the latter kind of acceptance that matters more. The neurotic person automatically assumes that others will feel just as much hurt and vindictive after a defeat as he does himself, therefore has a strong incentive to avoid winning, says Horney. Horney's analysis is incisive, marred only by her assumption that it applies exclusively to neurotic people. What she describes is in fact very widespread. Hostility and aggression in competitive situations may perhaps be most pronounced in, but hardly are confined to, neurotics. As the next chapter will argue, aggression is intrinsically connected to competition itself, and the fear that one's relationship with others will be changed for the worse by competing with them is, in truth, a very reasonable concern. Horny is referring to the neurotic tendency to project one's own characteristics onto someone else, but in the case of competition, the other person's hostility may be quite real. To expect the loser to be sore is hardly a symptom of ill health. This anxiety based on interpersonal tension, or the anticipation of it, is not confined to neurotics then. What is more, it does not manifest itself only as a fear of winning. It is the dynamic of competition itself that elicits anxious feelings, and to this extent, interpersonal-based insecurity should be understood as a third, independent reason that competition engenders anxiety, alongside fear of losing and fear of winning. The psychoanalyst Rollo May, in his pioneering interdisciplinary study of anxiety, came to the conclusion that competition is the most pervasive occasion for anxiety in our culture. Given the scope and rigor of May's work, such an unqualified declaration is very powerful. It is not merely a careless generalization or a rhetorical flourish. His assessment should give pause to the most enthusiastic defenders of competition. The reason for competition's generation of anxiety, May continues, lies not in the psychopathology of particular neurotic people but rather in the very nature of competitive individualism, which he takes to be one of the defining features of American society. This competitive philosophy militates against the experience of community, and that lack of community is a centrally important factor in contemporary anxiety. When people are defined as rivals, it is difficult to build an overall sense of community or establish a genuine connection with a particular other. Anxiety arises out of the interpersonal isolation and alienation from others that inheres in a pattern in which self-validation depends on triumphing over others. May then makes another point about this process. Like so much else about competition, it works in a vicious circle. Not only does competing make us anxious by threatening our relations with others, but it sets up a scenario in which we try to solve this problem by returning to the very strategy that gave rise to it. The culturally accepted method of allaying anxiety is redoubling one's efforts to achieve success. So, the anxious individual increases his competitive striving. But the more competitive, aggressive striving, the more isolation, hostility, and anxiety. This vicious circle may be graphed as follows: competitive individual striving, intrasocial hostility, isolation, anxiety, increased competitive striving. Thus, the methods most generally used to dispel anxiety in such a constellation actually increase anxiety in the long run. In sum, the security that is so vital for healthy human development is precisely what competition inhibits. We are anxious about losing, conflicted about winning, and fearful about the effects of competition on our relationships with others, effects that can include hostility, resentment, and disapproval. Today there is no shortage of articles, books, and most recently, workshops to help us with these insecurities. Any hesitations we might have about beating other people are seen as problems to be managed, not unlike overeating. This makes perfect sense. In a hyper-competitive society, resistance to competing naturally is defined as a weakness, albeit a treatable one. In a nation bent on waging war, soldiers who seem reluctant to kill people similarly are candidates for psychotherapy so they can be returned to normal. The analogy really is not far-fetched because compassion, too, can be construed as a weakness if it is experienced in a competitive situation. Here, for example, is Stuart Walker's reaction to the appearance of generosity during a competitive encounter. Nowadays, whenever I hear myself say, "Well, let's give him a break," I pull up short and ask myself, "Are you surrendering?" Whether deliberate or accidental, all forms of surrender represent regression, relinquishing the joy of self-demonstration for the solace of protection and passivity. Coaches and sports psychologists alike teach athletes to conquer their fears of losing, to overcome their apprehensions about winning, even to equate helping behavior with surrender. And after a while, we do not need to be ridiculed and dismissed as a quitter. We internalize the message and savagely attack ourselves for our anxiety and our reservations. But is a reluctance to make other people lose, with the attendant guilt, or, for that matter, an unwillingness to put victory before friendship, really something to be gotten over? I would contend it is more correctly viewed as an incipient sign of health. There is an important message in our recoiling from competition, just as there is in the coughing fit of a first-time cigarette smoker. Our task is to reflect on those anxieties, to weigh the values involved, instead of simply setting about the task of anesthetizing our sensibilities so that we can more efficiently triumph over others. The link between anxiety and performance has been documented. I have also said that anxiety or insecurity is undesirable in itself. But there are other manifestations of this psychological state, behaviors and physiological effects, that bear some mention. May, for example, notes that the high incidence of ulcer has often been related to the excessively competitive life in modern Western culture. The psychiatrist Herbert Hendon, an expert on suicide, names competitive pressures as a prominent contributor to the alarming rise in suicide rates among young people. Elsewhere, he suggests that drug abuse is another consequence of our culture's voracious competitiveness. These informal, though informed, observations tend to substantiate our own intuitions, but the hard data are still missing. It is difficult to isolate either structural or intentional competition as a variable, since competitive situations and people often are defined by other features that might also contribute to stress. In any case, I am not aware of any researchers who have attempted to test these hypotheses. One provocative exception is an experiment involving monkeys. Scientists in North Carolina have shown that aggressive monkeys eating a high-fat diet developed more atherosclerosis, clogging of coronary arteries, than did submissive monkeys, but only if the monkeys lived under stressful social situations that encouraged competition. More research on competition clearly is required, including longitudinal studies that test for the effects of switching to a competitive environment. The seriousness of the consequences and the strong likelihood of their relationship to competition unquestionably justifies such research projects. Further consequences of competition. Product orientation, play, it was argued in the last chapter, is activity for its own sake. It reflects a process orientation, an inclination to do something because of its intrinsic value. Such behavior is rare among adults in our society. We are product-oriented. Our work is governed by the demands of the bottom line, and often is justified as an onerous necessity of life. The time we spend in school similarly is construed as valuable only insofar as it contributes to later employment, with the pleas for relevance in our universities having evolved into a demand for marketable skills. Even leisure activities have come to resemble work. Results are what matter. When process has been supplanted by product in so many aspects of our lives, the same transformation must eventually occur with respect to the way we regard life itself. Who we are and what we are worth have come to be evaluated in terms of what we actually have produced or done, what tangible evidence of achievement can be adduced, what we have to show for ourselves. As soon as we illuminate this thinking, of course, its absurdity becomes clear. What is the point of all our frowning purposefulness? This shattering question, typically whispered in middle age when we can smell our mortality, and hastily dismissed as depression, never gets a satisfactory answer. The pursuit of results is ultimately futile because there is no grand summation or coherent unity to our lives other than what we confer on them by the process of living. A bumper sticker that nicely satirizes the commodity fetishism which tends to accompany the product orientation reads, "Whoever has the most things when he dies, wins." The economist John Maynard Keynes was similarly impatient with talk of the long run. In the long run, he is reported to have said, "We are all dead." Competition is not the sole cause of the product orientation, but it is a mighty contributor to such thinking. The goal of competing is, by definition, to win. To enjoy aspects of the activity in its own right is beside the point. It can happen, but it is at best tangential. More typically, the process orientation is actively discouraged because it seems a distraction from the main purpose. The student who loves intellectual exploration will not want to rein in this impulse as the syllabus demands, and she will not have the highest grade point average. The attorney who delights in the nuances of the law probably will not win as many cases as the one who cares only about the verdict and thinks in strategic terms. Competition is necessarily product-oriented. And as more of our activities are directed toward winning, the process orientation becomes attenuated in our lives. Our eyes remain fixed on the scoreboard. According to two social scientists, whose essays on sports were coincidentally published in the same year, this product orientation is associated with rigidity. In competition, wrote William Sadler, one's perspective is fixed on attaining a definite result. If this competitive posture were sustained, one's personality system would tend to become rigid. The intrinsic rigidity of the goal orientation, not surprisingly, makes the individual rigid, as well. We might propose that the more competitive an individual is, the less spontaneous he is, the less receptive to surprise, the less flexible his cognitive process. Here is psychologist Dorcas Butt. The character of the competitive athlete becomes increasingly undesirable as he develops an intense egocentric orientation with rigid psychological defenses and insensitivity. His obsession with his own winning status dominates his being. Not all competitors are equally obsessed, of course, but competition itself predisposes us, and not only athletes, to become invested in results to the exclusion of the process of working or playing or learning. Or thinking, it is common to view a situation as if only two alternatives existed, the black and white fallacy. America is either to be loved or left. I am either the most gifted and attractive person who ever lived or I am utterly worthless. Now we can respond to this thinking by pointing out that there are other alternatives, or a gray area in the middle, as the case may be, treating it, in effect, as a lapse in logic. Or we can deal with such an all-or-nothing attitude psychodynamically, tracing the unconscious roots of perfectionism to the first years of life. But neither of these responses is quite sufficient. Dichotomous thinking is more than an error in logic. It is a real-life orientation, closely connected to how we deal with other people. And there is more going on than individual psychopathology. The social structures that shape our interactions also affect our assumptions about the alternatives that are open to us. Specifically, dichotomous thinking is both conducive to and a consequence of competing. In a contest, there are only two possible results: you win or you lose. Those inclined to see the world in an either/or fashion will be attracted to competition, but by the same token, competition will help to shape such an orientation. A recent study of more than 3,000 women in careers found that the vast majority came to believe that there were only two possible outcomes to their actions. Either they would somehow manage to force themselves to run at top speed all day, every day, or they would lose so badly that they might as well not have entered the race to begin with. There was nothing in between. To slap a psychiatric label on these thousands, actually millions, of people misses the point. More useful would be an investigation of how a competitive culture teaches us that the world is divided into winners and losers, and how we generalize this lesson and come to see everything in either/or terms. The dichotomous worldview is a loaded one. When there are only two choices, typically one is seen as good and the other as bad. Everything we encounter can be neatly sorted out as rational or irrational, righteous or satanic, progressive or reactionary, reasonable or radical. A world that can be reduced to such simple antinomies is a much more manageable, comfortable world, one that does not ask us to grapple with tough moral questions. The price to be paid for this comfort is steep, however. To begin with, it is a distorted view of reality, akin to squashing the three-dimensional world into a two-dimensional flatland. Second, when dichotomous thinking is competitively generated, there is a tendency to be concerned almost compulsively about what is the best. People, including ourselves, are either number one or they are unworthy. This is not a terribly productive way of thinking about restaurant meals or computers, much less about human beings. Finally, When we perform this kind of value-laden division, we normally place ourselves on the good side, and we want the good to triumph over the bad. A gulf opens up between us and them, and this very division invites aggression, a topic to which I will return in the next chapter. This is what Strick described in the context of our adversarial legal system. From seeing right and wrong as the only two possibilities, we claim righteousness for ourselves and require an other, an opposite, religious, political, racial, national, sexual, name it, a non-self who embodies evil. To that degree does blame become a basic behavior and revenge a solution. Such polarity not only implies superior-inferior, as it denies complementarity, it also invites battle. For superior tends to become pitted against inferior. The steps are short from either / or to good / bad to we / they to we against them. Structural competition is a significant contributor to this ominous progression. Conformity, because the United States is both an exceedingly competitive and a highly individualistic society, and because competition here usually takes place at the individual, rather than the group, level, we often assume that competition promotes individualism. But the word individualism actually is associated with two very different philosophical movements. On the one hand, there is the individualism championed by such 19th-century Americans as Emerson and Thoreau and found in certain strands of 20th-century existentialism. It has to do with genuine self-sufficiency, conscience, autonomy, and nonconformity. The concern here is with the freedom to think and act on one's own, the commitment to deeply held values, the courage to risk disapproval and worse from others. On the other hand, there is the vulgar parody of this movement that one finds in contemporary pop psychology and parts of the human potential movement. This is the desperate attempt at self-reliance that bespeaks alienation from others, while, in turn, contributing to just this predicament. It is the blithe dismissal of relationship in "you do your thing and I'll do mine," the pathetic attempt to compensate for loneliness in "be your own best friend," the undisguised selfishness in "look out for number one." It is not at all surprising, by the way, to find this egocentricity walking hand in hand with a uniquely American proclivity for instant intimacy. The latter is just a superficial chumminess that vainly attempts to compensate for the effects of an ugly individualism. As political scientist Michael Parenti put it, our individualism is not to be mistaken for freedom to choose moral, political, and cultural alternatives of one's own making. Each person is expected to operate, individually, but in more or less similar ways and similar directions. Individualism, in the United States, refers to privatization and the absence of communal forms of production, consumption, and recreation. It is with this latter kind of individualism that competition is compatible. A narrowly conceived self-interest is conducive to beating out others. It is a short step from looking out for number one to trying to become number one. This version of individualism implies an alienation from others, and here, too, it is commensurate with competition. But competition does not promote the more substantial and authentic kind of individualism. On the contrary, it encourages rank conformity. Here is George Leonard. A culture dedicated to creating standardized, specialized, predictable human components could find no better way of grinding them out than by making every possible aspect of life a matter of competition. Winning out in this respect does not make rugged individualists. It shapes conformist robots. This is quite logical, since one can speak of outdoing others only if one is doing the same thing they are. Apples are not better than oranges. One can make relative judgments only about like quantities. As Arthur Combs put it, competition can only work if people agree to seek the same goals and follow the same rules. Accordingly, as competitors strive to beat each other's records, they tend to become more alike. If total conformity is what we want in our society, worshipping competition is one effective way to get it. Notice that this is not simply an empirical observation. People tend to act alike when they compete, but an analysis of the nature of competition. Unique characteristics by definition cannot be ranked, and participation in the process of ranking demands essential conformity. This is not to say that competition is the sole cause of conformity in American society. There are many other social, economic, and psychological forces at work that cannot be explored in this book. But competition at the very least tends to support and reinforce this process of standardization. In Chapter 3, I noted that competition dampens creativity. This is partly because the pressure to outdo someone else tends to make us conservative. We do not want to risk anything that could endanger our victory. Thus, the music critic Will Crutchfield finds that piano competitions result in interpretations that are all too similar to one another. In trying to win, performers concentrate on making no mistakes but shy away from the big technical risks, the truly astonishing effects. Creativity is anticonformist at its core. It is nothing if not a process of idiosyncratic thinking and risk-taking. Competition inhibits this process. The word conformity implies something more than acting like others, of course. To conform is to go along, to accept a situation as it is. Its opposite is not only individuality but the acts of questioning and rebelling. In this broader sense, too, competition seems to promote conformity. If winning is the goal, one naturally tries to avoid doing anything that could jeopardize it. It is true that skillful tennis playing is all that matters on the tennis court. One can act like a petulant child and still win important tournaments. But in most arenas, victory is at least partly subjective. Attitude toward authorities and general conduct do count in the kinds of competitions that take place in the office or the classroom. If I want to get the highest grades in class, I will not be likely to challenge the teacher's version of whatever topic is being covered. After a while, I may even cease to think critically altogether. In order not to fail, most students are willing to believe anything and not to care whether what they are told is true or false, writes Jules Henry. If people tend to go along to get along, there is even more incentive to go along when the goal is to be number one. In the office or factory where coworkers are rivals, beating out the next person for a promotion means pleasing the boss. Competition acts to extinguish the Promethean fire of rebellion. The inclination to take risks is stifled by competition in other respects, too. Not only does the competitor try to play it safe within a given activity, but the matter of which activities she gets involved in will itself be affected by the need to win. It is common for people to try to cut their losses by abandoning activities and environments in which they are less likely to win. A student who is driven, structurally or intentionally, to have a superior grade point average will avoid exploring subjects in which he may not succeed. A competitive sports enthusiast will stay with the games at which she is proficient. Anything I couldn't be the best at, I didn't do, one writer confesses, adding ironically. Vocational guidance counselors call this getting focused. Again, the tendency to specialize and, more specifically, to play to one's strengths is not exclusively a function of competition. But competition exacerbates this tendency, with the result that the need to win, which is to say, the fear of losing, will result in narrowing our lives, failing to experience new challenges. Competition thus can have the effect of discouraging healthy risk-taking, precisely because, psychologically speaking, so much is at risk when we compete. This phenomenon, too, shades into the matter of performance, since risk-taking is a prerequisite for many kinds of achievement. It is true that winning at some kinds of activities requires that competitors take risks. But the pressure to win generally has the opposite effect, and the quality of work suffers. When an artistic task is turned into a contest, children's products reveal significantly less spontaneity. When television networks have to scramble frantically for ratings, they tend not to innovate but to imitate, because innovation requires risk-taking, and risk-taking is antithetical to winning in the short term. It is not a coincidence that the three major American commercial networks, operating within a competitive framework, produce virtually interchangeable programming, whereas the BBC channels in England, which do not have to compete, offer a real choice. Besides its effects on performance, a sterile kind of safety is also a good deal less fun than risking, exploring, daring, challenging. But here the point to be stressed is that competition affects the personality. Turning life into a series of contests turns us into cautious, obedient people. We do not sparkle as individuals or embrace collective action when we are in a race. We are less likely to take advantage of a new opportunity when we know that it sorts participants into winners and losers. In fact, the more one appreciates the values that stand in opposition to conformity, the more skeptical one will be of competition.
They told us from the start, life's a race to win. Climb the ladder, guard your heart, don't let no one in. But what if there's another way, a path we've never tried, where rising up means lifting those who walk right by our side? We're better together, not made to compete. Stronger in harmony, not in defeat. No need to measure who's winning the game, when we share the joy, the light, and the flame. Cooperation, not conquest, we'll weather the storm. Together we rise where unity's born. Imagine every classroom, every field, and every stage, where helping hands are honored more than envy or rage. What if the prize was empathy, not standing all alone? What if we built a world where every voice is known? We're better together, not made to compete. Stronger in harmony, not in deceit. No need to scramble while others fall down, when lifting each other is how we wear the crown. Transform. Together we thrive where love is the norm. No contest, no rivalry, no need to be the best. Just honest hearts and open arms, let go of all the rest. The world is wide enough for all to find their place. Let's build a better way where kindness wins the race. We're better together, not fighting to lead. True success blossoms in meeting the need. A world where we care, where no one's left out. That's what this life can be all about. Cooperation's the key that unlocks the door. Together we shine, not rich versus poor. So here's to the dreamers who dare to be kind, in a world built on love, not just who's aligned. The game is not winning, it's how we all play. Let's choose connection and start a new